Imagine an island where the mail arrives 9 times a year, if the weather allows it, where there are no airports, no runways, no way in or out except by boat, and where a single wrong turn of the tide can leave a supply ship circling offshore for days, waiting for a calm enough moment to unload. This is Tristan da Cunha, the most remote inhabited island on the entire planet. Before we go any further, if strange and wonderful corners of the world like this one fascinate you, hit subscribe now, because we are about to spend the next while walking through exactly how 240-something people managed to build an entire life on a lump of volcanic rock sitting in the middle of nowhere. Turn on notifications too, because places like Tristan do not come around often, and you will not want to miss where we go next. Tristan da Cunha sits in the South Atlantic Ocean, and when people say it is isolated, they genuinely mean it in the most literal sense possible. The nearest inhabited land is St. Helena, itself hardly a bustling metropolis, and that is still around 2,400 kilometers away. South Africa, the closest continental mainland, is roughly 2,800 kilometers to the east. South America is even further in the other direction. To put that in perspective, you could fly across entire countries, cross mountain ranges, pass through multiple time zones, and still not cover the same distance that separates Tristan from its nearest neighbor. There is no other permanently inhabited place on Earth that sits this far from anywhere else. It is not an exaggeration to call it the loneliest address in the world, and yet, against every reasonable expectation, people have chosen to make it home for generations. The island itself is volcanic, dominated by a peak that locals simply call the Peak, rising steeply from the surrounding ocean to just over 2,000 meters, its upper slopes often dusted with cloud or even snow during the colder months. The entire settlement, every single house, every garden, every road on the island, occupies a narrow strip of flatter land on the northwestern coast, hemmed in by cliffs on one side and the restless ocean on the other. That single strip of habitable ground is almost absurdly small when you consider the scale of everything else about this place. The rest of the island rises sharply into steep, tussock-covered slopes, inaccessible ravines, and finally the black volcanic cone that watches over everyone below, like a permanent, silent reminder of exactly what this island is and how it came to be. The only settlement on Tristan carries a name that sounds almost too grand for a community of this size. It is called Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, named in honor of a royal visit back in the 19th century, though most islanders, in typical understated fashion, simply call it the settlement. Around 240 people live there today, spread across a small cluster of homes with corrugated roofs, neat vegetable patches, and narrow lanes that everybody on the island could probably walk in under 20 minutes. There is one shop, one school, one church for each of the two denominations present, one small hospital, one pub, and a handful of community buildings. That is essentially the entire built environment of the only town on the only inhabited part of Tristan da Cunha. Everyone knows everyone. There is no such thing as a stranger walking down the street, because there simply are no strangers here. Only residents, visiting officials, or the rare, extraordinarily patient tourist who has managed to secure a berth on one of the few ships that call at the island each year. To understand how people live on Tristan today, you first have to understand how they ended up there in the first place, because the story is almost as strange as the isolation itself. The island was first sighted by Portuguese explorer Tristan da Cunha in the early 1500s, and it carries his name to this day, even though he himself apparently never actually landed on it. For centuries afterward, the island remained essentially uninhabited, visited occasionally by passing ships, sealers, and the odd castaway, but never permanently settled. That changed in the early 1800s, when a garrison was placed there by the British, largely to prevent the island from being used as a base to help rescue Napoleon Bonaparte, who was being held in exile on St. Helena at the time. When the garrison was eventually withdrawn, a small number of soldiers and settlers chose to stay behind rather than leave, and from that tiny founding group, the entire modern population of Tristan da Cunha descended. This is perhaps one of the most remarkable facts about life on the island today. There are only a handful of surnames among the entire population, all tracing back to those original founding families. Names like Glass, Swain, Rogers, Green, Hagen, Repetto, and Lavarello. Practically everyone on Tristan is related to everyone else in some way, whether closely or distantly, a web of cousins and second cousins, and family ties so tightly interwoven that genealogists have studied the island for decades, fascinated by such a small, isolated gene pool, surviving and thriving across so many generations. Marriages on Tristan have always required a certain amount of careful navigation for exactly this reason, and over the years a number of outsiders, usually connected through work postings, ministry, or medical service, have married into the community and added a bit of new blood to the mix. But even now, the majority of islanders can trace their ancestry back to fewer than a dozen individuals who happened to stay behind on this remote outpost 2 centuries ago. Life on Tristan has never been easy, and the islanders themselves would likely tell you that in the most matter-of-fact way possible, without any dramatic flourish, because for them, hardship has simply always been the baseline condition of existence here. Everything the island needs that cannot be grown, caught, or made locally has to arrive by sea, and the sea around Tristan is not forgiving. The South Atlantic in this latitude produces enormous swells, sudden storms, and unpredictable conditions that can turn a routine supply run into a multi-day waiting game. There is no harbor in the conventional sense. No deep water port where a large vessel can simply pull alongside a dock. Instead, ships anchor offshore, and cargo along with passengers must be transferred using smaller boats, weather permitting, through a process that can be delayed for days if the swell is too dangerous. It is not uncommon for a supply ship to sit offshore for an extended period, its crew and the waiting islanders both watching the ocean, waiting for that narrow window of calm enough water to make the transfer possible. Because of this, planning on Tristan operates on a completely different rhythm than almost anywhere else in the world. There is no such thing as ordering something online and expecting it within a few days. If a part breaks, if a piece of equipment fails, if a specific tool or medicine or component is needed, and it is not already on the island, the wait can stretch into months. Islanders have become extraordinarily resourceful as a result, developing skills in repair, improvisation, and self-sufficiency that most people in more connected parts of the world have simply never needed to develop. A broken generator does not mean calling a repair service. It means someone on the island, often multiple people working together, figuring out how to fix it with whatever materials and tools happen to be available, because there is genuinely no other option. The economy of Tristan da Cunha is built almost entirely around the ocean that both isolates and sustains it. The most significant source of income for decades has been the Tristan rock lobster, more commonly known internationally as crayfish, which thrives in the cold, nutrient-rich waters surrounding the island. A dedicated fishing fleet, made up of small boats crewed by local fishermen, heads out regularly to bring in the catch, which is then processed at a small factory on the island, before being frozen and shipped off to international markets, particularly in the United States and parts of Asia. This single industry underpins a significant portion of the island's economy and provides employment for a meaningful chunk of the working-age population. Everyone understands, in a very direct and immediate way, just how much the community's well-being depends on the health of the surrounding marine environment, which is part of why conservation and sustainable fishing practices are taken so seriously here, not as an abstract environmental talking point, but as a matter of basic economic survival. Beyond fishing, the island generates income in a few other distinctive ways. Tristan da Cunha issues its own postage stamps, and philatelists around the world have long prized these stamps precisely because of the island's extreme rarity and remoteness. A letter posted from Tristan carries a kind of mystique that few other postal origins in the world can match, and stamp sales have historically provided a modest but meaningful contribution to island revenue. Tristan also mints its own commemorative coins in partnership with external agencies, again capitalizing on the appeal of its unique status as one of the most remote places on Earth. Wool from the island's sheep, along with a small amount of handicraft production, adds a further trickle of income, though nothing on the island ever approaches what most people would consider a large-scale industry. Everything here operates at a small, human scale, shaped entirely by the practical limits of geography and population. Agriculture on Tristan looks nothing like farming in most other parts of the world, largely because of the terrain and the harsh, wind-battered climate. Families maintain small plots of land, known locally as patches, scattered across the limited flat ground beyond the settlement, where they grow potatoes as the dominant staple crop, along with a modest range of vegetables suited to the cool, windswept conditions. These potato patches are not simply a hobby or a supplement, they are a genuinely essential part of how households feed themselves, a tradition passed down through generations, with specific plots often associated with particular families for decades or longer. Sheep and cattle graze on the island's grassland, providing meat, wool, and a further layer of self-sufficiency that reduces, even if it can never entirely eliminate, the community's dependence on imported food. Fishing supplements this agricultural base significantly, and not just the commercial crayfish operation. Islanders regularly fish for their own household consumption as well, bringing in a variety of local fish species that form a staple part of the everyday diet alongside potatoes, homegrown vegetables, and whatever meat is available from the island's livestock. Meals on Tristan reflect this straightforward ocean and land-based simplicity, prepared without the wide range of imported ingredients most people elsewhere take completely for granted. A household on Tristan learns to plan meals around what is actually available, not around what might be craved, and there is a kind of deep, practical wisdom in that approach to food that has been refined across 2 centuries of necessity. Housing on Tristan is simple, practical, and built to withstand the punishing weather that regularly sweeps across the island. Homes are generally single-story, constructed with materials suited to resist the powerful winds that can barrel across the settlement with little warning, given the complete lack of any real windbreak beyond the cliffs and the volcanic peak looming above. Corrugated iron roofing is common, chosen for its durability against the elements rather than for any particular aesthetic appeal, though the neat gardens and small vegetable patches surrounding many homes add a genuine sense of care and pride to the overall appearance of the settlement. Families tend their properties diligently, in part because there is simply nowhere else for excess energy and attention to go, and in part because a well-kept home and garden carries real practical importance in a community where resources cannot simply be replaced on a whim. Education on the island is centered around St. Mary's School, which serves children from the earliest years through to around the age of 16. Class sizes are tiny by any global standard, sometimes with just a handful of students in a given year group, and teachers on the island often know every single student personally, along with their entire family history, in a way that would be almost unimaginable in a larger, more anonymous school system elsewhere. After completing their schooling on Tristan, students who wish to pursue further education must leave the island entirely, typically traveling to St. Helena or onward to the United Kingdom, since there is no possibility of higher education infrastructure existing locally given the tiny population. This creates one of the quieter, more persistent challenges of life on Tristan, because every young person who leaves for further study faces a genuine choice about whether to eventually return to an island with such limited opportunities, or to build a life elsewhere in a more connected part of the world. Many do return, drawn back by family, by a sense of belonging, and by the particular pull that this extraordinarily unusual home seems to exert on those who grow up there. Others do not, and the island's population has slowly shrunk over recent decades, partly as a result of this quiet, ongoing outward drift of its younger generations. Healthcare on Tristan is provided through a small hospital staffed by a limited number of doctors and nurses, typically posted to the island on rotating contracts from the United Kingdom or South Africa. For routine illness and injury, the local facility manages perfectly well, and the medical staff on the island have developed a broad, generalist skill set out of sheer necessity, since there is no possibility of easily referring a patient to a specialist just down the road. For anything more serious, anything requiring specialized surgery, advanced diagnostic equipment, or ongoing specialist treatment, patients must be evacuated off the island entirely, a process that depends enormously on weather conditions, ship availability, and sometimes sheer luck. In the most urgent cases, this can mean waiting anxiously for a vessel to become available, or arranging emergency transport by whatever means can be found. A stark reminder of just how consequential the island's isolation becomes in moments of genuine medical crisis. Islanders live with this reality quietly, as simply another dimension of the trade-off they have accepted in choosing, or inheriting, a life on Tristan da Cunha. Perhaps no single event in the island's modern history illustrates the precariousness of life on Tristan quite as dramatically as the volcanic eruption of 1961. For generations, the volcanic peak looming above the settlement had been considered dormant, a permanent and largely unthreatening feature of the landscape rather than an active danger. That assumption was shattered when the volcano suddenly became active, with new vents opening disturbingly close to the settlement itself, lava flows threatening homes, and the small fish processing factory that formed the backbone of the island's economy. With almost no warning, the entire population of the island, all 260-something residents at the time, had to be evacuated. Ships arrived to take everyone off the island in a hurried, dramatic operation, and the population was eventually resettled temporarily in England, arriving in a country that most of them had never seen, in a climate and culture entirely foreign to everything they had known. The years that followed produced one of the more remarkable chapters in the island's story. Many islanders struggled deeply with life in England, finding the pace, the culture, the sheer scale and impersonality of life in a developed industrial nation profoundly disorienting after a lifetime spent in a community of a few hundred people on a remote volcanic island. Despite being offered the opportunity to remain permanently in the United Kingdom, with better access to modern amenities, healthcare, and opportunity than Tristan could ever hope to offer, the overwhelming majority of islanders chose to return home once volcanic activity had subsided enough to make resettlement possible. This decision says something profound about the particular bond these people feel toward their unlikely home, a bond that outweighed for almost the entire population the obvious material advantages of remaining in a wealthier, more connected, more comfortable country. When the ships eventually brought them back to Tristan in the mid-1960s, islanders found their homes and the settlement largely intact, spared by the specific direction the lava flows had taken, and they set about rebuilding their lives exactly where they had left off, as though the entire dramatic detour to England had simply been an unusually long and strange interruption to an otherwise continuous story. Governance on Tristan da Cunha reflects its unusual constitutional position in the world. The island forms part of the British Overseas Territory of St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha, administered ultimately from London, but managed day-to-day through a resident administrator posted to the island, who works alongside a locally elected island council made up of Tristanians themselves. This council handles the practical, everyday decisions that shape island life, from infrastructure and resource management to local regulations and community matters, giving residents genuine input into how their extraordinarily unusual home is run, even while the broader constitutional framework remains firmly British. There is a real sense of civic participation here, perhaps heightened rather than diminished by the small scale of the community, since every islander's voice genuinely carries weight in a population this size, and decisions made by the council have direct, immediately visible consequences for everyone who lives there. Connectivity to the outside world has slowly, gradually improved over the decades, though it remains a fraction of what most people elsewhere would consider normal. For a long time, communication with the rest of the world depended almost entirely on radio and the irregular arrival of supply ships carrying mail and news. Satellite technology has since brought internet access to the island, allowing residents to communicate with family abroad, access limited online services, and stay connected to global events in a way that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of Tristanians. Even so, bandwidth remains limited, and connections can be unreliable, shaped by the same remoteness that defines every other aspect of life here. Television broadcasts reach the island as well, offering a window into the wider world that simply did not exist for most of the island's history. Yet despite this improved connectivity, the fundamental physical isolation of Tristan remains completely unchanged. You can video call a relative in London from your living room on Tristan da Cunha today, and then walk outside and remember that the nearest actual human settlement is still thousands of kilometers away across open ocean, reachable only by a boat that might not arrive again for weeks. The natural world surrounding Tristan da Cunha is every bit as extraordinary as the human community that has managed to survive there, and the two are deeply, inescapably intertwined. The waters around the island support a rich and remarkably intact marine ecosystem, still relatively undisturbed by the industrial-scale fishing and pollution that have degraded so much of the world's oceans elsewhere. This is part of why the crayfish industry has remained sustainable for so long, and why islanders take conservation seriously, not as an imported environmental ideology, but as an obvious, practical necessity, born from watching their own livelihood depend directly on the health of the surrounding sea. The island group, which includes several smaller uninhabited islands nearby, such as Nightingale, Inaccessible, and the more distant Gough Island, has become internationally significant for its seabird populations. Millions of birds nest across this island group, including several species found nowhere else on Earth. Among them the Tristan albatross, an enormous, majestic seabird whose population has faced serious threats from introduced predators and long-line fishing practices elsewhere in its migratory range. Conservation efforts on and around Tristan have become a genuine point of pride and international significance, with programs specifically targeting the eradication of introduced rodents that have historically preyed on seabird chicks and eggs, threatening the survival of species that exist in vanishingly small numbers anywhere else in the world. The tiny, flightless, inaccessible island rail, one of the smallest flightless birds on the planet, survives only on the uninhabited island for which it is named, a living reminder of just how ecologically unique and fragile this entire remote archipelago truly is. Rockhopper penguins nest along the rocky shores in significant numbers, their populations closely monitored by researchers who occasionally visit the island specifically to study this remarkable, isolated ecosystem. Fur seals and elephant seals haul out along stretches of coastline, adding yet another layer of wildlife to an island where humans remain, in a very real sense, guests within a much larger and older natural world that continues largely on its own terms regardless of the small human settlement clinging to its narrow coastal strip. Biosecurity on Tristan is taken extremely seriously as a direct result of this ecological significance, with strict controls on what can be brought onto the island, specifically designed to prevent the introduction of new invasive species that could threaten the extraordinarily delicate balance that has allowed such rare wildlife to persist here for so long. Daily rhythms on Tristan follow patterns shaped as much by weather and season as by clock time. Fishermen check conditions each morning before deciding whether it is safe enough to head out onto the water, since the same rough seas that isolate the island from the rest of the world can turn a routine fishing trip into a genuinely dangerous undertaking with very little warning. Families tend their potato patches, according to the growing season, working the land in ways that would be entirely familiar to their great-grandparents, using techniques refined over generations, specifically to cope with the thin volcanic soil and constant, relentless wind. Children walk to school along the settlement's narrow roads, greeting neighbors who are, more often than not, also relatives in one form or another, in a community where genuine anonymity simply does not exist and has never existed for anyone. Sundays hold particular importance on the island, with church attendance remaining a significant part of communal life. Both the Anglican and Catholic congregations maintain an active presence in the settlement, and religious observance continues to structure the rhythm of the week for many island families in a way that has gradually become less common in many other parts of the developed world. The church buildings themselves stand as some of the oldest and most enduring structures in the settlement, weathering the same relentless winds and storms that batter everything else on the island, standing as quiet, steady anchors of community identity across generations of hardship, isolation, and occasional dramatic upheaval. Social life on Tristan revolves heavily around the pub, known locally as the Albatross Bar, one of the most remote drinking establishments anywhere in the world, where islanders gather in the evenings to socialize, share news, and maintain the kind of close, ongoing community bonds that a population this small absolutely depends upon for its own psychological and social well-being. In a place with no cinema, no shopping mall, no restaurants beyond what the community itself organizes, and no possibility of simply driving somewhere new for a change of scenery, these small, recurring social gatherings carry outsized importance. They are not simply leisure activities, they are one of the primary mechanisms through which community cohesion is maintained on an island where genuine isolation from the wider world makes internal solidarity absolutely essential to everyone's continued well-being. Celebrations and traditions on Tristan blend British and St. Hellenian influences with customs that have evolved uniquely within the isolated community itself over 2 centuries. Christmas and other significant calendar events are marked with genuine community-wide celebration, given the practical reality that with a population this size, essentially the entire island participates in any major communal event. Rat Day, a specific island tradition involving a communal hunt to control the island's rat population, an introduced species that has historically threatened both crops and the seabird populations that make the island so ecologically significant, has become one of the more distinctive annual community events, blending practical pest control with genuine communal participation and even a degree of festive spirit around what is, at its core, a serious ongoing conservation and food security effort. The Tristanian dialect itself represents another fascinating dimension of life on this isolated island. Having developed largely in isolation from mainstream English-speaking communities for the better part of 2 centuries, the way islanders speak has evolved its own distinct vocabulary, rhythm, and pronunciation, shaped by the mixture of British and other influences among the founding population, and preserved through generations of relative linguistic isolation from the rest of the English-speaking world. Linguists who have studied the island's speech patterns note distinctive features that mark it clearly apart from standard British English. A genuine linguistic curiosity that exists nowhere else, born entirely from the same profound isolation that shapes every other aspect of life here. Despite this deep isolation, Tristan da Cunha maintains meaningful, if inevitably limited, connections to the outside world. Researchers occasionally visit to study the island's unique wildlife, geology, or human community. Government officials from the wider Overseas Territory Administration make periodic visits to oversee governance matters. Extremely determined tourists, typically those willing to spend considerable time and money securing passage on one of the very few vessels that call at the island each year, occasionally make the journey specifically to experience what remains one of the most genuinely remote inhabited places any traveler can reach anywhere on Earth. For these visitors, arrival on Tristan represents something close to the end of the accessible world, a place that requires days of ocean travel simply to reach, with no possibility of a quick or convenient return should plans change or conditions turn unfavorable. The relationship between Tristan and its administering territory of St. Helena remains significant, given that St. Helena serves as the nearest point of connection to the outside world for most practical purposes, including medical evacuation, further education, and the receipt of goods and supplies that are then transferred onward to Tristan by ship. This relationship has grown more complex and, in some ways, more promising with the development of an airport on St. Helena itself in recent years. A development that has at least theoretically shortened the practical travel time between Tristan and destinations beyond the South Atlantic. Even though Tristan itself remains entirely without any aviation infrastructure of its own, and seems likely to remain that way for the foreseeable future, given the sheer difficulty and cost involved in constructing anything resembling a runway on such steep, limited, and geologically unstable terrain. Climate change presents Tristan da Cunha with challenges that mirror, in some ways, those faced by other small, remote island communities around the world, even though the specific nature of the threat differs somewhat given the island's unusual volcanic terrain and elevation. Changing ocean temperatures and shifting marine ecosystems carry direct implications for the crayfish population that underpins so much of the island's economy, meaning that environmental change happening across the broader South Atlantic could eventually translate into very real economic consequences for a community that has essentially no alternative industries to fall back on. Changing weather patterns, potentially including shifts in the frequency or intensity of storms, carry direct implications for the safety and reliability of the ship-based supply chain that the entire island depends upon for virtually everything beyond locally grown food. For a community this small, and this dependent on a handful of specific fragile systems, even modest disruptions carry outsized consequences that a larger, more diversified economy elsewhere might absorb without much difficulty. The population of Tristan da Cunha has fluctuated over the decades, generally hovering in the range of 200 to 300 residents, shaped by the ongoing tension between the pull of tradition, family, and belonging on one side, and the pull of opportunity, education, and modern convenience available elsewhere on the other. Every islander who leaves for education or work abroad represents both a potential permanent loss to the community and a potential future return, since many who leave eventually find themselves drawn back by the particular, hard-to-articulate sense of belonging that seems to characterize how Tristanians relate to their unlikely home. Island authorities and the community itself have given real thought over the years to how to sustain a viable population long-term, recognizing that a community this small faces genuine demographic fragility that larger, more connected places simply do not have to contend with in the same way. Employment opportunities on Tristan remain limited by the sheer scale of the local economy, with most residents working in roles connected either directly or indirectly to the fishing industry, government administration, education, healthcare, or the various trades and services required to keep a small, isolated community functioning day to day. Electricians, mechanics, builders, and other skilled tradespeople on the island often find themselves handling an unusually broad range of responsibilities compared to their counterparts in larger economies, simply because there is no possibility of calling in a specialist from elsewhere for anything beyond the most serious problems. This breadth of practical skill, developed out of sheer necessity, has become something of a hallmark of Tristanian working life, where versatility and resourcefulness carry far more practical value than narrow specialization ever could in a place this remote. Governmental and administrative roles connected to the overseas territory structure provide another significant source of stable employment on the island, alongside roles in the small hospital, the school, and the various infrastructure and utility services that keep the settlement running, including power generation, water supply, and the maintenance of the limited road network connecting different parts of the settlement and the surrounding agricultural land. Much like the pattern seen in other small, isolated communities around the world, public sector and essential service employment forms the backbone of stable, long-term work on Tristan, supplemented by the more variable, weather-dependent income generated through fishing and small-scale local commerce. Water supply on Tristan depends on the island's natural streams and rainfall, channeled and managed through a relatively simple but carefully maintained infrastructure system, given the complete absence of any alternative source given the island's isolation. Unlike some other remote island communities that struggle with severe freshwater scarcity, Tristan's volcanic terrain and consistently damp climate generally provide adequate freshwater for the modest population, though maintaining and repairing this infrastructure carries the same logistical challenges as everything else on the island, given how difficult it can be to source specific parts or equipment when something breaks down unexpectedly. Electricity on the island is generated through a combination of methods, including diesel generators that depend on fuel deliveries carried by the same infrequent supply ships that bring virtually everything else the island needs from the outside world. In recent years, there has been growing interest and investment in renewable energy options for Tristan, recognizing both the environmental benefits and the practical logistical advantages of reducing dependence on regularly shipped fuel supplies. Wind power in particular holds obvious potential given the island's famously blustery conditions, and various initiatives have explored expanding renewable capacity specifically to reduce the vulnerability that comes with depending so heavily on fuel deliveries that can be delayed by exactly the kind of rough weather that makes wind power such an attractive alternative in the first place. The relationship between Tristanians and the sea surrounding their island runs deeper than simple economic necessity, though the economic dimension certainly remains significant. For generations, the ocean has represented both the primary source of sustenance and income, and simultaneously the primary barrier separating the island community from the rest of the world. This dual nature, the sea as provider and the sea as obstacle, shapes much of the psychological and cultural relationship islanders maintain with the water that surrounds them on every side. Fishermen speak of the ocean with a particular blend of respect, familiarity, and caution that seems characteristic of communities whose survival has depended on the sea for so many generations, an attitude passed down through direct experience and inherited wisdom, rather than anything that could be easily taught in a classroom setting. Safety at sea remains a serious, constant consideration for anyone venturing out from Tristan's shores, whether for commercial fishing, personal subsistence fishing, or simply travel between different points along the coast. The same conditions that make the crayfish fishery so productive, cold, nutrient-rich waters stirred by significant ocean currents, also produce genuinely dangerous conditions for small boats operating without the kind of backup and rescue infrastructure that fishermen in more developed, connected coastal communities elsewhere might take for granted. Islanders have developed careful protocols and deep collective knowledge about reading conditions, understanding local weather patterns, and knowing precisely when it is and is not safe to head out onto the water. Wisdom refined through direct experience across many generations of fishing this particular, unusually remote stretch of ocean. Family structure on Tristan reflects the tight, interconnected nature of the broader community, with extended families often living in close proximity, sharing resources, childcare responsibilities, and support networks in ways that echo patterns common in small, close-knit communities around the world, though intensified here by the sheer scale of isolation and the complete absence of any possibility of simply moving away to a different neighborhood or town while still remaining nearby. When someone on Tristan needs help, whether due to illness, hardship, or simply the ordinary demands of daily life, the response tends to come immediately and directly from neighbors and relatives, since there is essentially no other support system available beyond what the community itself can provide, and everyone on the island understands this basic reality at some fundamental level, shaping a genuine culture of mutual assistance that many visitors from more individualistic societies find remarkable. The role of women within Tristanian society has evolved over the decades, much as it has in many other parts of the world, though shaped by the particular practical demands of life on such an isolated island. Women have historically played central roles in managing households, tending the vegetable and potato patches that form such an important part of the local food supply, and increasingly have taken on significant roles within the island's formal governance structures, healthcare system, and education sector as well. The Island Council and various administrative positions on Tristan have included women in meaningful leadership roles, reflecting a gradual but genuine evolution in how responsibilities and opportunities are distributed across the small community, shaped as much by the practical necessity of drawing on every available skilled person in such a tiny population as by any broader social or cultural shift happening in the wider world beyond the island's shores. Young people growing up on Tristan today face choices that would have been entirely unfamiliar to earlier generations, shaped by the gradual expansion of connectivity and awareness of the wider world that satellite internet and improved communication have brought to the island over recent decades. Where earlier generations of Tristanians grew up with limited awareness of exactly how different life looked beyond their own remote shores, young islanders today grow up watching the same global media, following the same online trends, and developing the same broad awareness of opportunities and lifestyles available elsewhere that young people almost anywhere else in the world now take for granted. This creates a particular complicated dynamic, where the pull towards staying connected to family, tradition, and the deep sense of belonging that comes from growing up in such a tight-knit, unique community exists in constant tension with the pull toward the opportunity, variety, and convenience that life beyond Tristan's shores can offer to anyone willing to leave. Many young Tristanians who do leave for education or work maintain strong, ongoing connections to the island throughout their time away, staying in touch with family through the same satellite internet connections that have transformed communication over recent years, and often planning, at least in the back of their minds, for an eventual return once education or career goals elsewhere have been achieved. This pattern of departure and eventual return has become a recognizable, if not universal, feature of how the Tristanian community has managed to sustain itself demographically across recent decades, even as the specific balance between those who leave permanently and those who eventually come home continues to shift somewhat with each new generation. The role of the fishing industry in shaping the island's future cannot be overstated, given how thoroughly the entire local economy depends on the continued health and productivity of the crayfish fishery specifically. Changes to international fishing regulations, shifts in global market demand, and the broader environmental pressures facing ocean ecosystems worldwide all carry direct, immediate implications for a community this dependent on a single, specific industry for the majority of its economic activity. Island authorities and the broader Overseas Territory Administration have given serious ongoing thought to diversifying the island's economic base, exploring possibilities ranging from expanded tourism, given the island's unique appeal to a certain kind of adventurous traveler, to further development of the postage stamp and coin collecting markets that have historically provided a modest supplementary income stream, to potential expansion of sustainable aquaculture or other maritime industries that could reduce the island's dependence on the crayfish fishery alone. Tourism on Tristan remains a genuinely niche pursuit, given the extraordinary logistical difficulty involved in actually reaching the island in the first place. There are no scheduled passenger services to Tristan da Cunha in any conventional sense. Visitors typically need to arrange passage on one of the limited number of vessels that call at the island throughout the year, whether specialized expedition cruise ships that occasionally include Tristan as an extraordinarily remote stop on a broader South Atlantic itinerary, or the RMS fishing and supply vessels that service the island directly from Cape Town, which occasionally have limited capacity for passengers willing to endure the multi-day ocean crossing required to reach this remote outpost. For those who do make the journey, the reward is an experience of genuine, almost startling authenticity, an opportunity to witness a way of life shaped entirely by isolation, self-sufficiency, and a deep, generations-old relationship with a genuinely wild and remote natural environment that has been largely preserved precisely because so few outsiders have ever had the opportunity or motivation to disturb it. The island's relationship with its designation as one of the most remote places on Earth has, somewhat ironically, become a genuine point of identity and even a modest source of economic opportunity, given the fascination that extreme remoteness seems to hold for a certain segment of travelers, researchers, and curious observers around the world. Tristan da Cunha appears regularly on lists and rankings of the world's most isolated inhabited places, a designation that islanders themselves seem to regard with a mixture of quiet pride and practical, unromantic acceptance. For them, this extreme isolation is not an abstract curiosity to be marveled at from a distance, but the concrete, everyday reality that shapes every single aspect of how they live, work, raise families, and plan for whatever comes next. Weather on Tristan remains a constant, dominant presence in daily life, shaping everything from fishing schedules to ship arrivals to simple decisions about outdoor activity on any given day. The island sits in a part of the South Atlantic, known for persistent winds, frequent rain, and generally cool, temperate conditions year-round, without the kind of dramatic seasonal extremes found in many other parts of the world, but also without the reliable, predictable calm that might make daily planning easier for a community so dependent on safe sea conditions for so many essential activities. Islanders have developed an intimate, practical relationship with reading local weather patterns, understanding subtle signs and indicators that might escape the notice of an outside visitor entirely, knowledge passed down through generations of direct, lived experience with exactly these specific conditions in exactly this specific location. The volcanic nature of the island itself continues to shape both practical daily life and the deeper psychological relationship islanders maintain with their unusual home. Following the dramatic eruption and evacuation of 1961, ongoing monitoring of volcanic activity has become a permanent, if generally low-key, feature of island life, with periodic assessments carried out to track any signs of renewed activity that might once again threaten the safety of the settlement. This awareness of living, quite literally, on top of an active volcanic system adds another distinctive layer to the particular blend of resilience, resourcefulness, and quiet acceptance of risk that seems to characterize how Tristanians approach life on their remarkable, unpredictable island. Community decision-making on matters ranging from infrastructure development to resource management continues to rely heavily on the kind of direct, consensus-oriented discussion that small, tightly connected communities everywhere tend to develop naturally, given the impossibility of avoiding your neighbors or escaping the consequences of any particular decision in a place this small. The Island Council serves as the formal mechanism for this kind of collective decision-making, but the underlying culture of direct, personal engagement with community matters extends well beyond formal council meetings, into the everyday conversations, at the shop, at the pub, after church, that shape how islanders collectively navigate the ongoing challenges and opportunities facing their remarkable, resilient community. Looking toward the future, Tristan da Cunha faces the same fundamental question that has shaped its entire existence for 2 centuries: how to balance the deep, meaningful benefits of maintaining a genuinely self-sufficient, tightly bonded, traditional community against the practical, ongoing challenges of sustaining a viable population and economy in one of the most isolated inhabited places anywhere on the planet. There are no easy answers to this question, and islanders themselves seem to approach it with the same practical, unromantic realism that has characterized their community's response to every other challenge across 2 centuries of survival against genuinely difficult odds. Climate change, shifting global fishing regulations, an aging population structure in some respects, and the ongoing pull of opportunity and connectivity available elsewhere in the world all represent genuine, serious challenges that will continue to shape the island's trajectory in the years and decades ahead. And yet, despite all of these challenges, there remains something genuinely remarkable about the fact that this community continues to exist at all, that 240-something people continue to choose, generation after generation, to build their lives on this narrow strip of volcanic coastline, thousands of kilometers from anywhere else, dependent on infrequent ships, unpredictable weather, and their own considerable collective resourcefulness for absolutely everything beyond what the island itself can directly provide. There is a particular kind of quiet, understated resilience woven into every aspect of daily life here, visible in the neatly tended potato patches, in the fishing boats heading out before dawn, regardless of how many generations have made that same journey before, in the school children walking to St. Mary's School past houses that belong to their own extended family, in the church bells marking Sunday morning across a settlement that has weathered volcanic eruption, complete evacuation, and 2 centuries of profound isolation, and simply continued on regardless. Tristan da Cunha will likely never become a large, thriving population center, It will likely never develop the kind of diversified, robust economy that might insulate it from the particular vulnerabilities that come with such extreme remoteness, and such heavy dependence on a small handful of specific industries and systems. But that has never really been the point for the people who live there. What Tristan represents instead is something that has become increasingly rare in a world defined by constant connectivity, rapid movement, and endless choice. A genuinely self-contained community that has learned, across 2 centuries of hard-won experience, exactly how to sustain itself on its own terms, in one of the most challenging and beautiful settings imaginable, holding on to a way of life that connects each new generation directly back to those first settlers who chose to stay behind on this remote volcanic island, rather than leave with the garrison that had once been stationed there. As another day begins across the narrow settlement of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, with fishermen checking the morning swell, families tending gardens that have fed generations of the same names, and children walking familiar paths past houses belonging to relatives they have known their entire lives, Tristan da Cunha continues quietly doing exactly what it has always done, surviving, adapting, and holding firmly onto its own particular, remarkable way of life at the very edge of the habitable world. No grand declarations mark these ordinary days. There is simply the steady rhythm of a community that has learned, across 2 centuries of extraordinary isolation, precisely what it means to build a genuine, lasting home in one of the loneliest and most beautiful corners of the entire planet. If this journey to the most isolated inhabited island on Earth captured your imagination even a little, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss wherever we head next, because there are still so many remarkable hidden corners of this world left to explore together. And places like Tristan da Cunha remind us that even in the most unlikely remote settings imaginable, human beings continue finding ways to build genuine, lasting communities against every conceivable odd. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you on the next journey.